The Kutasich is Chelek Chavav, Mishpatim Aleph. It's also a siyum, a Masechta Baba Basra, Bavli, and Yerushalmi. Lili Nishmis Rabbi Yosef ben Yamin ben Rabbi Menashe Kaltman. And we are learning the Schos, our dear friend, Yosef Shleima ben Yisha, for a Refuah Shleima Ukreva. The topic today is the topic of an Orev, of a guarantor. We're going to see the end of Bavli, the end of Yerushalmi. The Rebbe is going to explain the Machlekes and then give us an extremely profound and beautiful practical lesson from the two different siyumim in Bavli and in Yerushalmi. So just to introduce a couple of terms, there's a term called shibud. We actually used this term last week in the Yisrei Beis with regards to a yid being meshubad, committed to Hashem. Here it's more of a financial term, and shibud means that a lien is placed on the properties. And it's referring to a case where, for example, Reuven lends money to Shimon, so Shimon's properties are now on lien. There is a lien upon his properties that if he can't pay at the date of payment, then Reuven, the lender, can go to his properties and collect from Shimon's properties. Another topic that we're going to talk about today is the Arev, the guarantor, which means that if a person takes upon himself to be the guarantor for a specific loan, so Reuven lends money to Shimon, Levi is the guarantor. If Shimon doesn't pay on time, Reuven, the lender, can go to Levi and collect from Levi. Not only that, in certain cases, there is a lien on Levi's properties, that anything that Levi sold from the date of the loan, Reuven can then collect from those sold properties as well, because the way the Gemara explains this is once there was a contract with witnesses that Shimon borrowed the money and that Levi is the guarantor, it is now a matter of public record. So the buyer should have known that there was a lien on these properties, and therefore, if they went ahead and bought it, it was their risk. And if now Shimon can't pay his debt, and he doesn't have properties, then Reuven, the lender, can go to Levi. And if Levi doesn't have cash, then Reuven can go to Levi's properties that he sold. If he has properties, he takes from that. But if he doesn't have any properties because he sold it, he can go back to the properties that were sold since the date of the loan and collect from there. That's the concept of shibud. That's the concept of arev. Today we talk about when these two topics come together. In Siyum Masechta Bava Basra, in the Letzter Mishnah state. So now we're learning the last Mishnah of Masechta Bava Basra. Arev hayoytze la'achar chitum shtaris. An arev, a guarantor that comes out as the guarantor after the contracts were already signed. Goyvem and nechasim b'nei chayrin. He becomes an arev. In other words, it works. He can pledge to be a guarantor, but his liability is limited. The lender can only collect from the unencumbered properties, which means the properties that Levi has in his current possession. Because since it wasn't in the shtar, it wasn't in the document, it's not a matter of public record, and therefore the buyer couldn't have known that these properties there was a lien upon them because of the loan from Reuven to Shimon, and therefore if the properties were sold, it's nothing that could be done about that. But the properties that Levi has in his possession, and certainly the cash that he has in his possession, the lender, Reuven, can collect from that money or that property, even though it was la'achar chitum shtaris, even though it was after the signing of the contract. There was a story where this specific exact question came before Rabbi Shmuel, and he said exactly as this Mishnah says, that you can collect from the unencumbered properties. So Benanis argued with Rabbi Shmuel, and he said, no, you can't collect. Once the contract was signed, if he wasn't an arev in that contract, then he's not an arev to this property, and you cannot collect from him, not from the encumbered properties and not from the unencumbered properties. Amar le lama. Says Rabbi Shmuel, why do you say that? Omar Loi. So Bananas gives sort of a far-fetched example that to make his point. If there is a situation where one person is strangling another person in the street because he didn't pay his loan. Reuven lent money to Shimon. Shimon didn't pay. So now Reuven is grabbing Shimon by the neck to try to force him to pay. The Omarle. So the third person sees this going on and he says to him, Hanachle, leave him alone. And I will pay the loan. Pater. He's Pater, says Bananas. Because the loan was not given on the trust of Levi. He didn't lend them the money because Levi took it. Levi guaranteed it. Levi wasn't there when the money was loaned. Levi just stepped in now when there was a fight. And therefore, he's Pater. Similarly, sorry, let's continue. In what case is the guarantor obligated to step in and pay the loan? If he said he'll if a person says there was no loan yet, and the Ariv says, the guarantor says, lend him the money and I will pay you back if he doesn't pay you back, then he's chayiv, and only then shekain ale munase hilvo, because the whole loan was built on the trust of Levi. But if once the loan was done, then Levi is not a party to the loan, and therefore the lender cannot collect from Levi. So in other words, Bananas is arguing with Rabbi Shmuel. Rabbi Shmuel holds that seemingly, and at any point, the Arev can step up and become an Arev. But if it was without a star, if he wasn't in the original star, then it's a limited liability. Only nechasim b'nei chayrin, only current properties. And Bananas holds that anything that happens after the transaction of the loan doesn't count, and he cannot be an Arev. The Mishnah is Messiah. And then the Mishnah ends. Person wants to become wise. He should involve himself. He should preoccupy himself with the monetary laws of Torah. Because this is the greatest topic in Torah, the most complex, the most details. In it's like an ever-flowing well, because there's constantly new situations coming up, and you have to constantly learn and apply the halacha in those situations. And if somebody wants to involve himself, occupy himself with monetary law, Yishamish as Shimon Bananas should intern under Shimon Bananas, the same Bananas that was just arguing with Rabbi Shmuel. Here Rabbi Shmuel gives him a compliment that he knows his stuff. You want to learn this stuff, serve under Shimon Bananas. So that was the Mishnah. Now comes the Gemara. Even though Rabbi Shmuel praised Bananas for his expertise in this matter, nevertheless, halacha k'meisei ki Rabbi Shmuel. The halacha would be like Rabbi Shmuel and not like Bananas, that the person does become an Arev. Even after the loan transaction was done and closed, the person steps up to be an Arev. He is an Arev, like Rabbi Shmuel. Then the Gemara asks, what about the case of Chanuk that Bananas brought up, the case of the strangling? What would Rabbi Shmuel say in this case? And the Rashbam, who takes the place of Rashi in the second part of Baba Basra, says like this: Dilma mishum tzayda dechavre shenechnak namin gomeru makna. Do I say that because his friend was in trouble, so he was serious when he offered to step in, and he committed himself, he made himself liable for this loan, and he does become an Arev? Or maybe he was only intending to save him from being strangled. He was doing a mitzvah, but nothing. He didn't cause anything to be missing, which he would have if he had been there in the time of the loan and said, "Loan the money on my name." And he's not an Arev. In other words, do I say like that any time an Arev steps up to be an Arev, he can? Or like Rabbi Shmuel said, or would Rabbi Shmuel say that by the strangling case is different because he never meant to pay. He just meant to save the guy from being beaten up. Tashma, so the Gemara comes to answer to Amar Rabbi Yankiv, Amar Rabbi Yechanan, Chaluk Koya Rabbi Shmuel af b'Chanuk. Rabbi Shmuel disagrees with bananas even in Chanuk. He holds that even though you could say that he was just trying to save him, nevertheless, if he stepped up to be an Arev, he could be an Arev. He is liable to pay. Would you paskin like Rabbi Shmuel? In other words, earlier we said in the name of Rabbi Yechanan, halacha k'maisei by Rabbi Shmuel. Would we say the same thing by Chanuk? Tashma, the Chiyas Ravan of Rabbi Yechanan, Chalukay Rabbi Shmuel, af b'Chanuk. Ravan said in the name of Rabbi Yechanan that Rabbi Shmuel does argue even by Chanuk, even by the strangulation case. The halacha k'maisei af b'Chanuk, and halacha is like Rabbi Shmuel. That, in other words, Rabbi Yechanan held. We said it before in the name of Rabbi Bar Chana, then we said it in the name of Rabbi Yankiv, then we said it in the name of Ravin, that Rabbi Yechanan holds halachas like Rabbi Shmuel, that even after the chitum started, even after the transaction was closed, and even in the case of Chanuk, Rabbi Shmuel would hold that he is liable, the Arev, the guarantor, is liable to pay, and we paskin like Rabbi Shmuel. The Gemara is our Messiah. However, the Gemara concludes, Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel, Chanuk v'kanu miyadoi mishtabit. That in a case of Chanuk, only if a kinyan was made, only then does he become liable. Miklal da'arev bi'amalei boi kinyan. From this we learn that a general arev doesn't need a kinyan, which means in a regular case, a case of a loan where the arev is present at the time of the loan, he becomes meshubad, he becomes liable, even though there was no kinyan made with the arev. Nevertheless, the fact that he's present at the transaction time, that includes him in the transaction, that makes him liable. But by the case of Chanuk, which is after the transaction of the loan was done, then only if there's a kinyan would he become liable, which means that in the case of that the bananas described, where the person showed up and said, leave him alone and I will pay, he wouldn't be liable, because there was no kinyan, which is different than Rabbi Yishmael. And then a few lines later, the Gemara says, halacha is arev b'shas matan mois leibai kinyan, that an arev, a guarantor, during the transfer of the money of the original loan, does not need a kinyan, but achar matan mois bai kinyan. But if it happens later on, then he would need a kinyan. Das meint, as bei Chanuk wer dervas Amar Hanach Mishubad Davke Mitakinyan, which would mean that in the case of the Chanuk, in the case of the person that was getting beaten in the street, the Arev would only, the potential Arev would only become an Arev if there was a kinyan. But in the case of, that the Mishnah describes, that he walked up and he said, leave him alone, I'll pay the loan, which Benana says that he's not liable to pay, that becomes the halacha and not like Rabbi Shmuel. So the maskana of the Bavli is not like Rabbi Shmuel, even though earlier the Gemara said halacha is like Rabbi Shmuel, but the maskana of the Bavli is not like Rabbi Shmuel, and that is, which means to say that in a case when there was no kinyan, in a case where there was no kinyan, then the arev that comes after the later on, after the transaction of the loan was done, would not become liable to pay up as a guarantor. Ad kan divrei Gemara in Bavli, and with this we conclude the words of the Gemara in the Bavli. Sif Beis, we're going to explore the Yerushalmi, the Siyum of the Yerushalmi. In the Yerushalmi Zogdar the Gemara, so the Mishnah is the same, of course. So then you have the Yerushalmi. Rabbi Yisrael b'shem Rabbi Yechanan Amar. Rabbi Yisrael says in the name of Rabbi Yechanan, Afal pi shekil say Rabbi Shmuel is bananas. Even though Rabbi Shmuel praised bananas, al midrashay kilsei. He was praising him about his learning, about the way he learns an inyan. Aval eina halacha ki bananas, but the halacha would not be like bananas. This was Rabbi Yechanan's opinion, as it's brought in the Yerushalmi. Shimon bar Va b'shem Rabbi Yechanan, af b'chanuk halacha ki Rabbi Shmuel. And Shimon bar Va says again in the name of Rabbi Yechanan that even by Chanuk, where there's a thought to say maybe he was just trying to save the guy and he didn't actually mean to commit to the loan, the halacha will still be like Rabbi Shmuel, that he is responsible for the loan even without a kinyan. Aber in Yerushalmi wird nicht gebracht die Memre von der Shmuel adavke Chanuk v'kanum yodim mishtabed. The Yerushalmi does not bring the next part of the Gemara as it was brought in Bavli, that only if there was a kinyan does he become responsible? Nor does the Yerushalmi bring the end of the Gemara in Bavli, that the halacha is that an Arev, a guarantor, during the transaction does not need a kinyan, but after the transaction is closed, would need a kinyan, which would imply that that we're disagreeing with Rabbi Shmuel. Seemingly, up until this point, the Bavli the Yerushalmi is accepting that the halacha is like Rabbi Shmuel. However, unanstad dem is the Yerushalmi Messiah, but then the Yerushalmi concludes with the following statement: Omer Rabbi Yesi says, "Va'at." Shma minei, from here you could learn, Barnash David Sayed Lechavre B'Shuk, a person that was attacking his friend in the street, Asa Chad Vamar, and a person came and said, Shafke V'no Yohav, leave him alone and I will pay up the loan, Min Ahon Gabe, Umin Ahon Le Gabe. Literally this means from this person he can collect, from this person he cannot collect. What is the meaning of this last line? So the Rebbe is going to bring down the Pnei Moshe, who's the classic commentator of the Yerushalmi. The Rebbe is going to ask two questions on the Pnei Moshe's understanding of this Gemara, and the Rebbe is going to introduce his own understanding of this Gemara that's going to lead us to understand that there is a machlekes, Bavli and Yerushalmi. But let's take one bit at a time. Learn der Pnei Moshe, as Divri Rabbi Yesi is kimat mia. The Pnei Moshe holds that the words of Rabbi Yesi are to be learned in the tune of a question. Minahon gabe, minahon le gabe. From him you could collect, and from him you can't collect. And the Rebbe explains what the Pnei Moshe is saying. If we're going to follow, as the Yerushalmi seems to imply, that the halacha is like Rabbi Shmuel, and then it would lead to the fact, as if someone is attacking his friend in the marketplace, Miloshin, say the word sayid comes from the word suda, to capture something, to take its life away. And the other person is coming and comes and says, leave him alone and I will give you the money. I need from them loive, nor from them was amar shafke. And that would mean, says the Pnei Moshe, that the lender now goes and collects not from the borrower, but from the person that said shafke, leave him alone. How could you say that? Because how does this person become a debtor to the lender? All he was trying to do was to save the person that was getting hurt. He's thinking he's doing a mitzvah of saving the guy's life. He doesn't think that he's actually becoming indebted in debt to the lender. In other words, the Pnei Moshe is learning minahon gabe, minahon le gabe. You're now going to collect from the orev, and you're not going to collect from the loiva. That's how the Pnei Moshe learns. In other words, he's asking on halacha Rabbi Shmuel. How could you say af b'chanuk that even by the case of chanuk, the halacha is like Rabbi Shmuel that he becomes an orev? How could you say that? How could you say that you would borrow, that you would stop collecting from the loiva and now collect to the ariv when all he was trying to do was to help the guy? Late time pirush kumtois, and if you learn it this way according to the Pnei Moshe, as the maskana, we would conclude as the maskana in Yerushalmi benidin zeh, as David maskana in Bavli. That the conclusion of the Yerushalmi is just as in the Babli v'yazok and Mara upon him dart, as the Mara upon him, which is another commentary on the Yerushalmi says, as b'chanuk is the halacha nitvi Rabbi Yishmael, v'chazok is meshabat nafshi on akinyan. That the halacha is not like Rabbi Yishmael. In other words, Rabbi Yishmael is saying the halacha is that he becomes an arev, comes to Rabbi Yesi and says, minahon gabe, minahon le gabe. You're now going to put the whole onus on the arev. He was just trying to help. And that would mean that he's arguing with Rabbi Shmuel. And if that's how the Yerushalmi concludes, means the Yerushalmi is concluding that just like the Bavli, that the halacha is not like Rabbi Shmuel. So that's the pshat, that's the way the Pnei Moshe learns. That the Gemara says, that the Yerushalmi says that the halacha is like Rabbi Shmuel, and then comes Rabbi Yesi and argues on that with the Svarim minahon gabe, minahon le gabe. and concludes that the halacha is not like Rabbi Shmuel. So according to the Pnei Moshe, the Bavli and the Yerushalmi agree in their maskana, in their conclusion, that the halacha is not like Rabbi Shmuel. Says the Rebbe that to understand the Yerushalmi this way, the way the Pnei Moshe does, is very difficult. Why? Even if you would say that the halacha is like Rabbi Shmuel, and the person who says shafke, leave him alone, I'll pay the debt, is committing to become an arev and can become an arev, is aber menole ados meint as sich mishabet bis zu während der balchayv. As bis gave von ihm und nicht von Leve. Wie der Pnei Moshe mefarest mir es Rabbi Yossi. Why does the Pnei Moshe jump to the conclusion that means that you're going to the Orei first, that you're dropping the Leve, the borrower, and you're going to the guarantor first, which is the Pnei Moshe's question. Pnei Moshe is saying, why do you go to the guarantor before going to the borrower? Who said that's how it goes? Und nicht wie es ist Masber von der Sugya. Maybe what the Rabbi Shmuel would be saying would be, as it's understood from the sugya, from the topic in the Gemara, as ein shibud is betur arev, that he becomes committed as a guarantor. V'hainu as der chayven liegt eich weiter auf dem leve, that the loan is the responsibility of the borrower first. Und zum erst darf der Malva tevea sein dem Chayv beim leve, and the Malva, the lender, would first go to the borrower to collect his money. And only later he would go to the Arev, to the guarantor, if the borrower didn't pay. The Mishnah says very clearly how this works. So the whole foundation of the of Rabbi Yossi's question, according to the Pnei Moshe, is saying that you now drop the loiv and go to the Arev, you drop the borrower, you go to the guarantor. Why would I even think that to trigger this question? The Pnei Moshe's question is based on a misunderstood premise. The Rebbe has another question on this approach of the Pnei Moshe. The fi pirish of Pnei Moshe is tmias Rabbi Yossi you said this of them tam was leim is kaven alatz lazah. That why take? Why is Rabbi Yossi asking this question? A, because he was under the impression that you're going to the Arei first. But how is that a question? Says the Pnei Moshe. All he was trying to do was to save this person. He wasn't trying to commit to actually paying the money. Is this who time from bananas in their Mishnah? So then, in that case, the Rabbi Yossi, according to the Pnei Moshe, is saying the same thing as the Mishnah. Which is what the bananas introduced this example as a proof, as an explanation of his shita, that you can't come afterwards and become and become an arev, because he's only trying to save the situation. He's not trying to become an arev. So you already had this discussion between Rabbi Yossi and between Rabbi Shmuel and bananas in the Mishnah. What's Rabbi Yossi being mechadish over bananas? So those are the two questions. Number one, that Rabbi Yossi, that the Pnei Moshe is under the impression that according to Rabbi Shmuel, you would go to the Arev before the Loiva. And where does that premise come from? Number two, Rabbi Yossi's reasoning, according to the Pnei Moshe, is because he's just trying to help his friend, and not because he's trying to actually commit, which is the same thing as bananas. And what's the chiddush of Rabbi Yossi over bananas? The Gemara wouldn't introduce an Amoida if he's saying the same exact thing as the Tana of the Mishnah. And if the Rebbe comes to a different understanding of the Yerushalmi, not like the Pnei Moshe. As Divrei Rabbi Yossi Yerushalmi is a hemshech sufrir. Rabbi Yossi is coming as a continuation to before. He's not arguing with what we said before. He's coming as a continuation to before. Af b'chanuk halachik Rabbi Shmuel, where the Gemara in the Yerushalmi said that even in a case of chanuk, even in a case of when a person is being strangled and the Arev is coming to save him, the halach is like Rabbi Shmuel, that he does become an Arev. And Rabbi Yossi could masbir sein, farvos eich bei Chanukah is mishtabed b'li kinyan. Rabbi Yossi is coming to explain why that works. How is it that even without a kinyan, the person steps into the middle just to save a friend, save a person from being beaten up, and he becomes meshubad, he becomes liable for that for that loan. Rabbi Yossi is coming to explain Kitul Kamon, as we will get back to this, what Rabbi Yossi's explanation is in Sif Dalid, after the Rebbe explains the Machlekes. But we must understand the Rebbe's understanding in the Yerushalmi, that Rabbi Yossi is coming to explain why the halacha is like Rabbi Shmuel v'hainu, which means to say, as in Yerushalmi is the maskana nidvi in Bavli, that the conclusion of the Yerushalmi is different than the Bavli. The conclusion of the Yerushalmi as Bachanuk is der Amar Shafke mishabed nafshe echan hakinyan, and the person who said Shafke, which means he said, leave this person alone and I will pay the debt, does become an Ariv. The maskana in the Bavli was that he doesn't become an Ariv. Oh, unless he makes a kinyan. The maskana of the Yerushalmi is that he does become an Arev, even without a kinyan. And Rabbi Yossi is explaining that. Not arguing on it, he's explaining it. As the Rebbe will explain exactly what Rabbi Yossi is saying in the words. But now we have a machlokes Bavli in Yerushalmi, that in a case of Chanuk, in a case when somebody was being strangled in the street, and a third person comes and says, leave him alone, and I will pay up the money. According to the Yerushalmi, if there was no kinyan, according to the Bavli, if there was no kinyan, the Ariv is not liable for anything. And according to the Yerushalmi, even if there was no kinyan, this person becomes an Ariv. And if the borrower can't pay, then the lender can go to this third person who now becomes an Ariv and collect the loan from him. As the plug zwischen Bavli and Yerushalmi. See, Ariv lacharei matan mois boi kinyan. This argument between Bavli and Yerushalmi, if a person wants to come after the transaction and become an Ariv, whether he needs a kinyan or not, which means that Rabbi Shmuel holds you don't need a kinyan, you become an Ariv even without a kinyan, and this is how the Yerushalmi paskins. Versus the Bavli, who holds that unless you make a kinyan, you are not an Arev. You're not a party to this entire thing. What's the basis of the machlekes? Is a pluk to klolis in them geder v'sibas hashibut from Arev is a general machlekes that is based upon the fact what is the definition and what triggers the obligation of the Arev. If you have two people that one took a loan from the other, clearly the person who took a loan, by taking that loan, he became liable to pay up that loan. But if you have a third person that's not involved in the loan, meaning to say he didn't lend, he didn't borrow, and he didn't make a kinyan, he's just standing on the side, and he's saying, I'm guaranteeing this loan, what brings him into the picture? Once we'll understand how he gets into the picture, we'll understand why the Bavli says what it does, and why the Yerushalmi says what it does. B'negia an Ariv, b'shas matan mois, zogt Rav Ashi. In the Gemara in Baba Basra, a blot earlier, Rav Ashi says, with regards to an Ariv that's there during the giving of the money. Now, there was a regular Ariv present at the time of the transaction of the loan. That joy, that pleasure that the Ariv receives, that he is being trusted, Gamar umishtabed nafshe, with that he commits himself to paying this loan. Pashtus made this. And seemingly this means, as the Anoah Velcher is Mekabel von Zayin Mehemen, this Anoah, this pleasure that he receives from being trustworthy, that someone trusted him, that someone believed that he is a player, so to speak, he is worthwhile to be trusted to pay up the loan, is genug zu uften the mishtabed nafshe. This with this, he's getting something. In every transaction, there's a give and a take. So he's receiving hana, he's receiving pleasure, and with that he commits himself to this loan. That's a Gemara in Baba Basra, Daf Kuf Ayin Gimel. However, the Nemuke Yosef in the end of Baba Basra, with regards to a case of an Ariv, a guarantor that's present during the giving of the money, Zogt, the Nemuke Yosef says something differently. The fact that a person could become liable even without a kinyan is kivon da alpiv ha'itzi ma'osim mitachas yodeh. The words of the Nemuke Yosef here is because on his say so, this person, the lender, released the money from his possession. The whole reason he released the money was because the Arev said he was taking responsibility. That triggers his obligation. Then Mukhi Yosef says this with more words earlier on. He says, even though there's no kinyan there, he didn't make a kinyan, it's just words, but nevertheless, he does become liable. The Malva can tell him, if not for you, I would never have lent the money. Now, then, says something very similar. The lender could tell the guarantor, if not for you, no money would be released from my possession. So the Nemuka Yosef, and the Rebbe will explain this in the next column a little bit more exactly what this means. The Nemuka Yosef says that it's because the Arev's word was so powerful enough to create the whole loan, therefore that makes him liable. And that which the Gemara says clearly, the Nemuka Yosef, the Rabbi Gershom are Rishonim. So they can't argue with Rav Ashi. So how do they tie to what Rav Ashi is saying, that it's about the hanoah, the enjoyment that he's getting? This explains why we don't look at the words of the Arev as an asmachta. In this context, asmachta means like a saying, like something that he said that he didn't mean it literally. So in other words, a person could say, it's on me, take it, it's on my shoulders. And maybe he just wants to make it happen. Sometimes people say, just do it, and we'll see what happens. We'll cross that bridge when we get there. It's on me. He doesn't literally mean that he's going to actually pay from his own pocket. He means, let's trust this guy, maybe we'll do something, whatever it is. So how do I know that when the Arev says, it's on me, that he means it literally, and not just in the Weltarein? So that says Rav Ashi, because a person gets hanoah from being trusted, when he says that, it means that this is what to trust. So the Nemuka Yosef says that when Rav Ashi says B'hai hanoah d'kamehemenlei, it doesn't mean that is what is causing the shibud. That just lets us know that it's not an asmachta. But what causes the shibud, what causes the commitment, is the fact that the Malva can say that it was because of the Arev that the whole loan took place in the first place. Lefiza kumtois, the Rebbe is going to explain in the next column exactly what it means in the Nemuka Yosef. But let's see it in the context. The Fiza kumtois, as their tam was their Arev is mishabed nafshi b'li kinyan, and the fact that an Arev can commit himself, can become liable even without a kinyan, we can say it in these two ways. The liability of the Arev is not just because he's enjoying this. It's because of the fact that it was his say-so that caused this whole loan to happen. The guarantor caused a lack of money, a loss of money to the lender. And just to clarify, says the Rebbe, as we understand it from the Gemara itself, this doesn't mean to say that the Arev is obligated here because he caused the loss. Garmi is a concept in halacha where if you said something or did something that caused a loss to someone else, then you're liable for that loss, even though it was indirect. Ukilu neymar as der etzem gram ichisur moment shafta from achiyuv, as if to say that it's an issue of hezek. You caused him damages. You offered it to be the guarantor, and because of that, he loaned the money to someone that didn't have to pay back, and now you caused them a loss. That's not the pshat. We're not saying over here that this is a case of that he caused a loss. No, it does as a sibe to pale sein dem shibud nafshi from dem Arev. We're saying the fact that the lender lent based on the say-so of the Arev, of the guarantor, is enough to create a responsibility on the part of the Arev. In other words, das was der Malvat made Simam given of smach with the Arev's raid. Was beweist as der Malve is same Mechdaite have to mention the fact that the lender lent the money on his say-so, which means that he considers the Arev as a trustworthy person. Does Gufa wirkt auf none of us mishtabed sein. In other words, the question is always, how does a third party become party to this transaction? So here, he is part of it. He's the one who made it happen. So it's not because he caused the loss. It's because he is a necessary piece to the whole loan. And therefore, because the whole loan happened, the whole transaction happened because of him, therefore, automatically that makes him party to this transaction. That's Aleph, Beis, but there's another way of looking at it. Like the simple understanding of Rav Ashi. It's because of the pleasure that he gets from being trusted. Here, the Arev is receiving. In Aleph, it's what the Arev is giving. The Arev is giving a foundation to the whole transaction. So the Arev was the foundation of the transaction, and therefore he's party to it, and he becomes liable. In Beis, it's what he's receiving. What the Arev is receiving an enjoyment, a pleasure that he was trusted in this transaction. That joy is like a kinyan. Because of that, he becomes meshubad. Now, what would be the halachic relevance between these two approaches? In other words, every time we see two reasons, if it's tam reasons, then it doesn't mean much. We have to truly understand the difference between these two reasons, we have to find a case where one reason would apply, one reason wouldn't apply, and then we see the relevance of this reason versus that reason. For the nafkamina b'neim is the gabi chanuk. This very case that we were discussing previously, when one person was strangling another person in the street, and the third person approached and stopped the fight and said he's going to pay, here would be a difference whether you say chanuk, whether you say that the reason of an Arev in general is because of the fact that he was the foundation of the loan, or the fact that he receives the pleasure from being trusted. If the issue is that he caused the loan, he caused the person to lose money, that would mean that in the case by the strangled person where he said leave him alone, which in that case he didn't cause the loss, but the loan was not given originally because of the Arev. So the Malva is not so is trusting him that much and not relying on him that much. The only reason, according to reason Aleph, that he commits is because the Malva included him in this transaction. But in this original transaction, he wasn't included. So therefore, the Malva is not showing major trust in him. So therefore, he is not committing. And because of that, if there was no kinyan, he would not become an Arev. If the reason is because of the chassid and mamayna, that he's the one that's causing the loss, meaning to say that he's the foundation of the loan. But if the reason why the way how the person becomes liable is because of the fact that he receives pleasure, then we could say that even in the case of Chanuk, the person who said Shafke, the person who said leave him alone, does commit himself. The Gezag Frier, as we said before, because he still gets enjoyment from the fact that he's being trusted, even though the original loan wasn't on his say-so, but now they're trusting him, they're stopping to fight. Even though the loan wasn't given for him because of him, but the fact that he is removing the pain of his friend who's being strangled is a pleasure that he receives, that he could save his friend. And with that he commits himself, and therefore he's liable. So in the case of Arev, in a general case of any case of Arev, there's two ways of looking at it. Either it's because he's the one who caused the whole loan, or it's because he receives pleasure from being trusted. And these two reasonings would affect the case of Chanuk differently. If you say that it's because he caused the loan, in the case of Chanuk, he didn't cause the loan, and therefore there's no Gamar Mishabat Nafshe, he is not committing, and therefore he's not liable. Whereas if it's about pleasure, the fact that he's saving his friend causes him pleasure, and with that, he commits himself, and he does become an Arif, even without a kinyan. According to this, we could say, as in dem bashtet der chilik zwischen maskanas abavli, as chanuk boy kinyan, umaskanas Yerushalmi is a dafnit kinyan. Now we can explain the machlekes Bavli and Yerushalmi, where the Yerushalmi holds that he becomes an Orev even without a kinyan, and the Bavli holds that he does not become an Orev unless there's a kinyan. Shitas Bavli is computer Rabbi Nagesh from Anamuka Yosef as Bahia now the Kamahem and Lays Nitkin Tamas because the Orev is not Gomer Mishabat Nafshe. The Bavli is following the approach of the Nimuka Yosef and Rabbi Gershom that the Hanoah, the pleasure of being trusted, is not enough for a commitment. As is nor genug aufzutan, only taste and kinas macht. It's enough for us to know that it's not just an expression, but it does not create a shibud. It does not create a commitment. Because that pleasure that is receiving is not powerful enough to create a liability or a commitment to the arev. And the whole reason why he becomes committed is only in the case where the lender lent because of him and he's causing a loss of money in actuality. In the case of the strangulation, where the arev didn't cause any actual loss of money, is nitod there's nothing that should trigger this commitment. Therefore, only through a kinyan does he become an arev. So now the Bavli is taking the approach of the Nemuka Yosef. Oh, Meshita say Yerushalmi is as the Siba after Shiba the Arev. B'shas Matan Mois is neither Chasrim from the Mal. But the Yerushalmi holds that what's causing the Shiba, what's causing the commitment, is not the fact that he gave away his money on his say so. No, the Kabbalahs are no shall Arev to come Hamelay, but it's because the Arev is receiving enjoyment from the fact that he's being trusted. Und the Riber is be'ein zeich be'an Arev in fall from Chanuk lachri Matan Mois, and also in the case of Chanuk there is some form of Hana from being trusted, and therefore the Yerushalmi holds that he becomes an Arev even without a kinyan. Yes, Leimar. And based on this, we could say, we're going to now go back to the Rabbi Yossi in the Yerushalmi. We're going to explain what Rabbi Yossi is saying. Ados kum to Rabbi Yossi, Yerushalmi Masber sein. This is what Rabbi Yossi is saying. And from this you can hear, a person that was attacking his friend in the marketplace. And the person came and said, leave him alone, and I'll give the money. The fact that he's saying is from him you could collect, meaning from the Arev, and not from the Loive, is nitamaskana. Is not saying a halacha conclusion as er mont uf und dem was amar shafke, that he goes to collect from the person that said leave him alone. Uf und dem leiva is a clowned gave, and he does not collect from the leiva. That's not what Rabbi Yossi is saying. No, this is a tam v'siba after Shiba the Arev. Rabbi Yossi is giving the reason why the Arev now becomes committed and why the Arev now becomes liable. Because that when he says these words, leave him alone and I will pay. He causes that the lender should stop harassing and pressuring the borrower. And in this moment he can go to the Arev and collect from him. Is that the mitku from the Kabbalah annoy the Arev receives in pleasure from this. Is a governor Mishpatim nafshe. And with that pleasure, the Arev commits himself. In other words, the Gemara in Yerushalmi earlier said, Halacha Rabbi Yechanan. Halacha Rabbi Shmuel. Says Rabbi Yossi, you know why? Because the fact that now that this person came and said, I'll pay this bill, and minahon gabei, and the person now can go to the Arev and say, I'm collecting from you. Uminahon le gabei, and he doesn't have to go to the loive, he can go to the Arev, because obviously at this point the loive doesn't have the money. That enjoyment that the Arev gets, that he's collecting from him and not from the loive, with that enjoyment, he commits himself and becomes liable. So the Rabbi Yossi is only explaining the approach of Rabbi Yishmael, and therefore, in conclusion, there is the machlekes Bavli and Yerushalmi, where the Bavli holds that a person does not become an Arev. And the reason is because in the case of Chanuk, there's not enough of an interest in the part of the Arev to commit himself. Whereas, according to the Yerushalmi, a person does become responsible because he's receiving Hana, and with that Hana, he commits himself to become an Arev. It's going to get easier from here. Once we understand the two approaches of Bavli and Yerushalmi, from this point on, the Rebbe is going to explain it in a more Pnimi Yisayanam way, and it's going to get easier from here. We can make this more geschmack. Explain this. As the dust is verbunden mit dem Chilek Klali zwischen Bnei Bavel and Bnei Eretz Yisrael. This approach, whether you say like Bavli that a person needs a much bigger commitment in order to become an Arev, and in the case of Chanuk, that commitment is not there, and therefore he does not become an Arev unless there's a Kinyan. And in Yerushalmi is necessitating a much smaller a commitment, and therefore that much of a commitment is in the case of Chanuk, and therefore he becomes an Arev even without a Kinyan, is going to be connected with a general difference between the people who live in Bavel versus the people who live in Eretz Yisrael. The whole concept of the commitment of the Arev, of the guarantor, is we're saying, what did the person mean? Did he mean to take it upon himself, and therefore he's a part to this of not? So really, it's very much dependent on the person's knowledge and on the person's conduct. And we actually find in halacha that if, let's say, the accepted practice of the merchants is that they would become obligated to be an arev even after the transaction, if that is the accepted practice, then that is how it's done, even though the halacha is not like that. But the halacha is based on how people do things in this specific in monetary things. So therefore, when it comes to Arev, it's not just about the strict halacha like this or like that. It's what did he mean when he said it? What was he thinking? So this machlekes Bavli and Yerushalmi is going to depend on the culture of the different places. Those who live in Bavel and those who live in Eretz Yisrael would mean something different when they say different things, and therefore, there's actually a machlekes between the two because it's two different places, and the people living there have two different lifestyles. And when they say things, they mean different things. And the Rebbe explains. The Gemara sagt, as ich in Arevus verlitten, das was Eden sein Arev eine für die andere. There's a concept of Kol Yisrael Arevim Zalazah. For example, the reason why if someone doesn't know how to make a bracha, then another person can make a bracha for them, even though they're not doing that mitzvah or they're not eating that food, whatever it is. The reason is because since Kol Yisrael Arevim Zebazah, so if that person has an obligation, I have that obligation, and if he can't do it for himself, I can do it for him. So there's a halacha concept of Kol Yisrael Arevim Zebazah. Says the Gemara that this whole thing only after the Yidden crossed over the Yarden. And in Eretz Yisrael, they became responsible for each other. They became unified. And therefore, until the Yidden crossed the Yarden, Hashem did not punish private sins, meaning private people that sinned, because since what they did wasn't affecting the other people, there was no need to punish them. And the Rogachover explains on this, as the Baal Kol Yisrael have a K'may Min Yachid, since once they went into Eretz Yisrael, so everybody becomes one unit, Loi Begeder Nifrid, they're not separate entities. Therefore, this guarantorship, this interconnectedness helps. But if they're not one unit, then there's no concept of them being responsible one for another. Das is der Chilik zwischen Eretz Yisrael and Bavel, and this concept of that there are they a unit, one are all Yidden one unit, or are they separate, each separate units? This would be the difference in Eretz Yisrael and Bavel. The Gemara sagt, "Ein uchlusa bebavel." The Gemara says there's no uchlusa. Uchlusa means multitudes, which means to say there's a halacha that if a person sees uchlusa Yisrael, he sees Yidden in the multitudes, which the Gemara explains is he sees 600,000 people at one time. You make a bracha baruch chacham harazim, the wise of the unknown, and the Gemara explains that. That when you have 600,000 people that ain't they saying Shabbos, they don't think alike, they don't look alike, and the Eibishter knows everyone what they're thinking, what they look like. So you make a bracha. The incredible the Eibishter is Chacham Harazim. But the Gemara says that in Bavel there's no achlusa, there's no such bracha to be made in Bavel. But it's saying the Lekatzirov says the Rogachover that even if you have 600,000 people, they're not one unit, they're not combined into the same thing, and therefore the bracha doesn't apply. Also, there's no such thing, besides for Tisha B'Av, there's no such thing as a public tainus in Bavel. And the way the Rebbe understands this is there's no tzibur. There's no overarching community in Bavel, and therefore there's no tainus tzibur. Shaking Eretz Yisrael, Dortmund are needing Givorna Metzias for tzibur, whereas in Eretz Yisrael, the Yidden became one congregation, one group of people, and therefore only after they crossed over the Yarden, when they went into Eretz Yisrael, then they became one entity, and then this guarantorship or this responsibility is upon them. So now the Rebbe explains, is the Arevus in down given by Eden ständig, even though once the Eden crossed the Yarden and took upon themselves this responsibility. Now this applies in all times and in all places, even outside of Eretz Yisrael, wherever they might be. Which is why a Yid could be Moitzi, another Yid could making a bracha. Von them was ein Tainus Sibur Bavel. Nevertheless, from the fact that even after the Yid went into Eretz Yisrael, we still don't establish a Tainus Sibur in Bavel. Yes, is dort nicht talking Shleimus forget Sibur because there isn't the full-fledged element of tzibur, of a congregation, of a group, is moving as the Ikar Shleimus Arevus in Eretz Yisrael. Davka Ba'idin V'Chazan in Eretz Yisrael. So it's understood that the more perfect form of oneness and therefore of guarantorship is in Eretz Yisrael. In other words, because we see that before they went into Eretz Yisrael there was no Arevus at all, and that Arevus began only in Eretz Yisrael. Once they went into Eretz Yisrael, so even now that the Arevus applies everywhere, but outside Eretz Yisrael, it's on a lesser level than it is in Eretz Yisrael. When in Talmud Bavli, where the place of Bavel was a place where the responsibility and the oneness of Yidden was not so strong, so there we lean to say, in order to trigger this responsibility from one Yid to another, there has to actually be an action. See, b'shas matan noise was the Arav tutuf b'mirosei as the malvas will beil sein chaser. Either during the transaction where the Arav causes that the malva should actually take money from his pocket and give it to the other person, or if he wasn't there at the time of the transaction, then lav midi chasrei, so he didn't actually cause the malva to give away money, then the Arav ken zich b'shabbat, then there has to be a kinyan. But in Bavel, there has to be something that creates this responsibility. It doesn't happen by itself. So either he has to be there during the transaction, or he has to make a kinyan. Mashenki ba'amaroim from Talmud Yerushalmi, Talmudish Eretz Yisrael, was dort in sein Lieden agedet tzibur v'mele ba'arevus u'b'yisachtos, where the Amaroim and Talmud Yerushalmi, a place where there is a concept of oneness, there is a concept of mutual responsibility. Was hot taken from the mice of a pail. The shibud, the commitment of the Arav does not necessitate an actual action. It says genug of them the anova says mekabel. It's enough the fact that he gets anah. So now the Rebbe is taking this machlekes bavli and Shami, which the Rebbe explained that is based on what makes the Arav, and says it's not just a halachic thing. It's actually something that connects with who the people are. In Bavel, you need more of an input on the part of the Arav to actually become responsible. Whereas in Eretz Yisrael, there's already a mutual responsibility. So as long as there's some form of anah here, some sort of gain to the Arav, that's enough, and he becomes responsible. And therefore, the Yerushalmi holds that even without a kinyan, even Achli Matan Mois, the Orev is responsible. And to see this from the more Musar perspective, more ethical, more personal perspective. When Yidden are in their homeland, in Eretz Yisrael, where they are seen as a complete entity, ein ganzer Tzibur is bazean pflegt demot. Sorry. They are seen in a revealed way as one group of people. Anything that affects one yid, even just something that's painful, is genug zu peil sein, als das Vater Id soll sich übergeben und sich mistabed sein, the fact that another yid is hurting is enough for another yid to get involved. And is mekabel enough from them was nemt up at Tzar von zweiten Niden. This becomes his enjoyment that he's helping another yid. Weil mit dem zweiten Niden sein nicht kein Freiber unter der Sache. And there is because he and the other person are one thing. Und wir steht in Yerushalmi as a different Yerushalmi, and the Rebbe brought this Yerushalmi numerous times in his Torah. Das ist wie zwei Hände von ein Guf, that it's like two hands of one body, and one hand is not going to hurt the other hand. One yid is not going to hurt another yid, but in this case, the context is that in Eretz Yisrael, yidden are much closer to each other. If one yid is hurting, the other yid is hurting, and that's enough to kick in the Arev responsibility. In Bavel, whereas in Bavel, where this unity is not as revealed. In Bavel, if you want one yid to commit to another yid to become liable for the other yid's needs, that will only happen if there's a matter of pain, but if something is felt by him, if something is actually missing. But in the case of the Artiv coming later, not when he gave the loan, so the loan wasn't given because of him. Then, in order to get involved, he has to actually do something such as a kinyan. Since there isn't an automatic connection between the Yidden, there has to be a kinyan, something that shows that he's connecting himself to this thing. And only then does the malva, does the lender feel that he can rely on this person and accept him as the guarantor, and only then does he become liable. So in Sif Hey, the Rebbe was still talking halachically, so to speak. Why is it that in Bavel you need this and in Yerushalmi you don't need it? In Sivav, the Rebbe looks at it more on a Musadik way. That in Eretz Yisrael, they love each other. They love each other in a way that as soon as someone is hurting, the other person feels it and therefore is committed. Whereas in Bavel, this feeling of Achdus is not so strong, and therefore there has to be something that proves that this person is involving himself, which is if it's not during the transaction, is the kinyan. And therefore the Bavel holds that you need a kinyan, and if not, it doesn't become an arif. Now the Rebbe is going to go into Avei Deruchnis, where the Rebbe is going to zoom out a little bit and discuss this whole concept of Baba Basra, and then we're going to get back to Bavli versus Yerushalmi in the case of Ariv, Avei Deruchnis. So it's known that these three Bavas, the word Bava literally means a gate or a doorway. So there's the first, there's the middle, and there's the last. But really, we know that it's really all one Masechta. So that Allah Drai Bava is Masechta. Fine. So that's the intro. Now, the idea of Nezikin, which means damages. In other words, the all three together would be Masechta Nezikin. And they're divided into Babakama, Bamatzi, Bababasa. So the idea of Nezikin represents the idea of Galus. In Galus is where the forces that are distracting a Yid from serving Hashem exist. So Nezikin represents Galus. Mesechta Nezikin, the halacha Nezikin in Torah, but the Mesechta, which refers to the Torah aspect of Nezikin, is the limud velches mevatel di mazikim umemele vertuchtem uis Galus neskum de geula. This the Mesechta Mazikin is the antidote to Galus. It's what gets rid of the Mazikin and brings the Geula. Ishleimar. Thus, the time Panimi was Nezikin is ausgestellt in drei Bavis. This is a deeper reason why Nezikin would be divided into 3 sections. As the Zohar says that there's 3 Geulas. It's also brought in the Torah that it's connected Avram Yitzchak v'Yaakov, which is why Yaakov, which is Emes is Nitzchi, which is why the third Beis Hamikdash will be forever, because it's Yaakov Avinu, and the third Geula will be forever. So the 3 Bavos represent the 3 Geulas that are connected with the 3 Batei Mikdash. When the fire is cooking, and that's why that explains that the fact that it's all one Masechta. And the dry Batei Mikdash nit came as under the Batim, as it's been discussed in other places. We actually learned this in Isicha and Parashas Pekudei, I believe, that all 3 Batei Mikdashes are not 3 separate structures. There's Zelbe Bayis that says Nevad Givarin. It's the same structure that got lost, so to speak, when the Rebbe carried him and the Rebbe is giving back that same bias. So it's Chad Mesechta. It's one Mesechta, it's one Beis Hamikdash that's just coming back to us 3 times. Rashi brings on the pasuk Eilep Kudei Mishkan Remez LeMishkan Shenismashkin B'Shnei Churbanim, that the word Mishkan can also be read as Mashkin, as a collateral. That it's a Remez to the Beis Hamikdash that was taken as collateral twice. That Inyan from the Churbanim is not as the Mikdash of Chaz Hashem Batal. The destruction of the Beis Hamikdash was not that the building was destroyed. That as it's blazed in an Ephah from Mashkin, it was taken as a collateral. Was bleibt ganz. What's a collateral? Where the lender, for example, takes something, a car, an item to his possession. It doesn't break it, doesn't destroy it. Now that's gefindt sich lefisha b'shus hamalva. Temporarily, it is in the possession of the malva. So in other words, the Eibush that took back the Beis Hamikdash, but it's not like he destroyed it. So it's Chad Mesechti, it's the same Beis Hamikdash. The last Bava is connected. Golos Ha'achrin represents this last Golos that we're in right now. And this we see a transformation from the beginning of the Masechta to the end of the Masechta. The Masechta Bava begins with Shutfim, with partners that own a field together, a yard together, and they want to create a partition in that Chatzah. Spiritually, the partners are Hashem and the Yidden. The idea from Galus is the idea of Galus is a partition, a division between the partners. Says there is something that's separating between the Eibishter and Yidden. So you can see him in Masechta. There's siyum from Galus. When we get to the end of the Masechta, which represents the end of Galus, is B'dini Arif, in the din of the guarantor. This represents the unity between Hashem and Yidden. Through the inappropriate conduct during Galus, Yidden became owned, so to speak, by the side of negativity. But because Yidden are close to Hashem, the Eibishter becomes the guarantor. He becomes responsible for the Yidden. He takes upon himself this responsibility to give the Yidden the necessary tools that they need to get rid of this shibud, this commitment to the other side. Und das ist der Bir Pnimi. So let's go quickly down these terms. Nezikin is Galus. Mesechta Nezikin Torah is Mevatel the Galus. The 3 Bavis are the 3 Gulas, the 3 Batei Mikdash. Baba Basra is the last Galus. Shutfin is the Eibishter and Yidden. Ratzulas is Mechitza and Galus. There's a separation between the Eibishter and Yidden. And now comes the Arevis and the Shibud, where the Eibishter steps in and helps the Yidden to get out of this Galus and to get rid of their loan, their responsibility to the other side, to the side that's not holy. Thus the Bir Pnimi in the Pluk analysis Bavli Yerushalmi. Now we go back to Bavli Yerushalmi. As we get to the end of Galus, we know that the darkness of Galus is double and 4 times is terrible darkness. As the Gemara describes in the end of Seita, the spiritual darkness and the physical darkness at the end of Galus. And thus is the Remes was to see him from Masechta Babas is wegen the din von Chanuk. And here you see this in the fact that the Baba Basra, which is the end of this galus, is talking about a din of a person that's being strangled. But thus there's matziv Rachman al-Tlaf and Nidin B'Seis Mana Galus, which this is the matziv that we're in right now. As the Cheshach HaGalus is so stark, the darkness is so strong, as me feels sich in ganzen der Stick Rachman al-Islam. We feel strangled, you feel choked durch dem Cheshach HaGalus because of the darkness of the galus. Of them sagt the Gemara. So the Gemara says, in this end of galus, when we feel so choked, we feel so strangled, we feel the darkness is so strong. Hey, Leighton Bavli and hey, Leighton Yerushalmi Asaf B'Chanak Halacha Rabbi Shmuel. Both will, the Bavli and the Yerushalmi agree that the halacha is like Rabbi Shmuel, that this person could become an arif. As the arif, that Meshubah do misgeiv from the arif, that we do collect from the arif. Was Beruchni is made does not kukenik v'vasad mit desadin da an arch zagen as eden davon alein batzol dem chayv, which from the spiritual perspective is that even though from the perspective of midas adin of the Eibishter's judgment, there's room to say that Yidden should pay up their own bill. Is the halacha of Rabbi Shmuel, but nevertheless we look at it not from Midas Adin, but from Rabbi Shmuel, who's a Kayin Gadol Ish Chesed, who was a Kayin, and Kayin represents Chesed. We look at this from the more kind perspective, as the Eibishter sich mishabed zu Yidden and sold Kivyachol into the Chavis, that the Eibishter commits to the Jewish people and he pays their debts. So that's both Bavli and Yerushalmi agree that that the Arev is responsible. The only difference is, do you need a Kinyan? The Chilik is not in Vasfar and Eifen Verder Shibud. The difference in Bavli and Yerushalmi is, how does this Shibud become? From the Gemara in Bavli, where the darkness is very strong, and therefore the oneness between Hashem and the Yidden is not so revealed. There has to be something that is done. And the Rebbe explains, Yidden have to demand from Hashem. As the Eibishter that the Eibishter should insert himself into the situation that Yidden are in, and do something, get more involved in order to help the Yidden. Bavli says there has to be a kinyan, which means to say we have to demand of Hashem to not just say I'll pay the debt, but in order to be able to pay it, he has to get involved, he has to come down and be with us in this situation. But as we know, Bavli is compared to the darkness, and Yerushalmi is compared to light because there's much more clarity and much more direct learning style. So Yerushalmi represents light. Is the Shutzvus von Eibishter mit Yidden auf a mehr lichtiger from the partnership between the Eibishter and Yidden is much more illuminated way. But the man in the Eibishter outside of the Chavri, all we have to do is remind Hashem that his friend is in pain. The pain that Yidden are experiencing in the captivity and in the sorrow, in the hardship of Galus, which is expressed when Yidden daven and demand ad masai. As we say in Slichas of Shivasar B'Tammuz, Al titnu domilei ad yechenin vad yasim es Yerushalayim tila ba'aretz. Don't give him rest. Domi miloshin vayidim arin. Don't be silent until he will establish and make Yerushalayim a place that's praiseworthy. Und das ist shein dai v'heiser. That the demand of Ad Masai, the demand to the Eibishter that his friend is in pain, that is enough. As the Eibishter is Meshabet Sham Krevet, the Eibishter dedicates himself to his nation und bringt gleich die Geula durch Mashiach Tzidkenu, and brings immediately the Geula through Mashiach Tzidkenu. Was Yivne Mikdash. The Hashlishi v'habasra b'makayim, was going to build the third and the final, as in Baba Basra, the final Beis Hamikdash. He's going to build it in its place. V'gadol yiyeh kveda bayis hazeh hachim in Arishain, and this Beis Hamikdash will be greater. The honor, the glory of it will be greater than the previous one. U'b'meheira v'yameinu mamish. So we just took a machlekes Bavli and Yerushalmi. We explained it Al pi halacha. We explained it b'derech hamusar, and then we explained it beruch nisan yonim as well, that it's actually a metaphor for the challenge of Yidden and Galus, and the Eibishter is our Arev, and there's different levels of how the Eibishter becomes an Arev. Either we have to demand Hashem to make a kinyan, which means to get involved, or the very fact that we remind him how painful this galus is enough to get to, that the Eibishter should pay our bills, which means to say that he should take us out of galus and end this galus and build the third Beis Hamikdash, u'b'meheira v'yameinu mamish.